and welcome to another episode of Earth911's Sustainability in Your Ear. This is the podcast conversation about accelerating the transition to a sustainable carbon neutral society, and I'm your host, Mitch Ratcliffe. Thank you for joining in. Measuring greenhouse gas emissions, sometimes known as carbon accounting, is the hottest topic in business today because regulators are now requiring companies to report their emissions along with other environmental impacts, and consumers have made clear that they want low-impact products and services. Our guest today is Lucas Fraser, founder of Breeze, which makes a carbon tracking tool for business that measures scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions and is offered largely for smaller businesses. Breeze is an easy-to-use platform that provides locally relevant results based on information it provides about the sources of energy in your region and by the type of products that you buy and use. For example, when setting up Earth911's profile, I was able to enter our electricity consumption and get the emissions data based on the Western power pool that we get power from. And that reflects the average mix of generation sources in my area. So it's a more accurate way for us to get a quick assessment of our total emissions. In a few minutes, I was able to profile our CO2 emissions for our virtual team. We don't have any commutes and several of us work only part-time. It's not exact, but we know the business produces approximately 13.5 tons of scope 1 and 2 emissions, and potentially a little bit of scope 3 in there, from energy, broadband services, computer use, and travel. And that's about the same as the average U.S. household, which the EPA estimates produces 14,020 pounds of CO2 a year. Breeze gave me the basis for deciding how Earth911 can change, and every business needs that information. Now, despite the International Energy Agency's projection that carbon emissions will peak by the middle of this decade, the agency also reports that CO2 emissions reached a record 37 billion tons in 2022. It's time to stop talking about reductions and start achieving them. While reducing carbon emissions is critical to preventing more global warming, we also need better insights into the environmental impacts, such as water use, raw materials extraction, and waste created in manufacturing and distribution, to fully understand the opportunities to lower society's impact on nature. And when we shop for goods and services, this information can help us make better decisions, although most companies have not found a way to communicate their impacts in easy and useful ways. So our recent series on the Ecological Benefits Framework is all about making the impact and regenerative benefits created by companies and individual products clear to the people who buy from them. So there's a lot to talk about when we get into carbon accounting. Let's get to the conversation. You can learn more about Breeze at MyBreeze, all one word, no space, mybreeze.io. Welcome to the show, Lucas. How are you doing today?
I'm doing well, Mitch. How about you?
It's a beautiful morning here in the Pacific Northwest. A little warm for the fall, but we'll take it.
Can handle it. I was looking out today, and I'm in Montreal, and seeing a lot more reds and yellows come out, which is always beautiful.
It's that time of year. Hey, tell me about your background. How did you come to launch Breeze? I mean, starting a carbon accounting company isn't the thing everybody goes, hey, I'll do that.
Yeah, it's a bit of a long journey, but I think the summary is really that I studied business when I was in university and got my hands on a lot of accounting and financial related projects working in private equity. I also did some marketing working with Tesla and some other kind of clean tech organizations, but I hadn't chosen them really specifically for the clean tech side, just for the positions and the opportunities. But they really started to get me thinking about the way that I could use my career to start driving change. And I started doing personal study and additional research and really started directing my career after university towards sustainability, climate-focused projects. And what that really started with is right after university, I launched a sustainability consultancy with a couple of my friends from university, as well as a more experienced environmental engineer, and that was called Circle Environmental Solutions. And we were basically just, throwing things out there and seeing if we could help companies capture some of the sustainability advantages from a business perspective that we had been seeing from case studies in like the B Corp movement, examples like Patagonia, see if we could tell that story. And then what started to emerge was, okay, we want to show that we're sustainable, that we're an organization that prioritizes our environmental and social impacts. How do we prove that? And how do we get people to believe what we're saying? And so a lot of that work started moving towards what KPIs are relevant, what's the data infrastructure that you need to be able to justify your sustainability claims. And then the other side is that when you look at the full picture of sustainability priorities, material topics, subjects, climate always comes back up. it always becomes relevant because in our perspective, it's really the issue that has a clock on it more than any other. We have to address our emissions. We have to reduce them as soon as possible to avoid the worst effects of climate change. And so that juxtaposition of constant need and urgency in terms of validating sustainability-related, climate-related claims drove that desire to move towards carbon accounting.
You have an emphasis on small and medium-sized business. What drove you in that direction?
Yeah, that was once we had the idea that we wanted to help solve the climate challenge, that we wanted to work with businesses to reduce their carbon emissions, to reduce global effect on the climate. We started looking at the landscape and what options were out there. And so through the consulting work, working with larger organizations, we realized that there's basically two ways you can go if you're a company of any size that wants to determine your emissions. You can do the self-serve route where you go online, you start reading the protocol yourself, you maybe find an Excel calculator tool without, maybe that much weight or liability to it, and you just kind of figure it out and hope that it's right. Or you hire what were at the time and often still are relatively expensive service providers, whether that's a consultant or a enterprise level software platform. But for those smaller organizations who account for a huge portion of supply chain emissions globally and who often have much more of an inherent desire to, build sustainability into their operations, there weren't any really good choices out there. And so we wanted to build a platform that was almost like, QuickBooks could be for financial accounting, a platform that you can just sign up, start using, figure out the rules as you go, and have some confidence that you're doing things right.
So how does Breeze work? And in particular, how do you get the local and regional energy emissions factors, which is very challenging for most people to get?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, it's one of the key challenges of doing any carbon emissions inventory is the emission factor component of it. Essentially what Breeze is, it's a platform that allows you to calculate your full organization's greenhouse gas footprint. And that's across the scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. Scope 1 being directly what you burn or direct emissions from your operations. Scope 2 being the emissions from purchased electricity. And scope 3 being all other value chain and non-controlled emissions from your operations. So we allow you to calculate all those. We do that based on activity data or economic data. So it's possible to measure emissions directly with primary data. You actually count the amount of carbon coming out or do calculations like that. But most organizations use activity or spend data.
Right.
And so that's what you input into Breeze. We take that data, multiply it by an emission factor, which is what you were referring to before, and that gives you the end emissions value. The emission factors can be quite challenging to find. But the interesting thing is that there's really two sides to the emission factor market. There's the commonly used fuel and energy sources, things like electricity grids in the US and Europe, and fuels like natural gas, diesel fuel, gasoline, where we are pretty confident that per gallon of gasoline burned in this type of car, here's how many units of CO2 are emitted. Those are actually published by governments all over the world. And so there's very reputable science-based factors available to the public from the United States EPA, the Canadian Environment and Climate Change Ministry, the UK DEFRA, Australia, New Zealand, Asia. There's resources all over the world who publish these, but it's very disaggregated and hard to find. What we do is compile those, the most essential, most useful ones, and present them to the users of Breeze.
So what are the first steps? I mean, what are the things you need to do to get ready to use Breeze?
So we actually have a really good article or guide on this called the Comprehensive Guide to Measuring Business Greenhouse Gas Emissions. But really what you need to do is go through the scoping exercise. So you look at your operations, you can do a mapping exercise to determine upstream, downstream, what are your impacts. And this basically tells you across the common categories of emissions, what activities do we have in our business? And then for each of those activities, think of business travel, think of fuels consumed, electricity consumed. You start going out and trying to find either activity data or purchasing data in those categories.
So does that mean I should get my utility bills out, the last year's travel invoices and so forth?
Exactly. Yeah, and this is something that in Breeze, what we try to do is recommend based on your sector, which emission sources will likely be relevant to you, and then you can just go and follow the guidance in the platform to find those bills, to find those purchasing receipts and all that kind of information that you might need to upload.
Now, there's a lot of methodologies involved, but I want to dig into one just as an example, and that's how your tool estimates travel impacts based on the cost of a ticket, which doesn't necessarily map to the class of seating and the distance that you travel. Is that kind of information that specific? I flew economy or I flew business. I flew 3,000 miles versus 1,500 miles. Something that an employee would interact with Breeze to input.
Yeah, 100%. And this is somewhere where there's a variable scale of data quality across all emissions estimations, because
Mhm.
ultimately at the end of the day, all of this activity data times emission factor, they're estimations with varying levels of quality. Spend data, relatively low on that totem pole. It's just above taking a wild guess, because there's so many variables. Like you said, if you look at flights, for example, we do have an air travel general emission factor,
Mhm.
but based on whether it's a short, medium, long haul flight, based on the seating class, these things affect the emissions. And there are some airlines who might have better emissions or lower emissions from similar flights based on their use of sustainable fuels. That's where you get the customizability side comes in. So we have default recommendations for templates, but also you can add any specific emission factors that you'd like. And we do have, by seating class, by short, medium, long haul emission factors available. You just have to start kind of drilling down into those categories if you have that data.
That sort of implies, though, that every employee is going to need, in addition to the expense report, to do an emissions report. Is that where you imagine our engagement as employees with our impact is going to really come into focus?
I think that's a big part of it. I think the idea and what we like to recommend is that for all of these key data points that will keep coming back every year and that contribute to a large part of your emissions, think electricity, natural gas, but also flight data, also purchasing in major categories that go into your products. When you're capturing this data, let's say in accounting software or in an ERP, we shouldn't have a separate report for your expense report and your emissions report, but we should add an additional value. So you just say, I spent $1,200 on this flight. It was a medium haul flight, or that could even be calculated, and here's my seating class. Or if you're purchasing fuel and documenting that expense, you could just say it was $80 at the gas station, plus I got 40 gallons. And so it's a matter of slightly adjusting those processes.
Absolutely. And so make it easy, make it convenient, in the sense that we don't add to the burden of being accountable, and provide enough information that as an employee, I can think about how to change my ways.
Absolutely. Yeah, because that's the next thing. We don't want to just measure this and leave it there in the platform or in a report. It's time to start engaging. It's time to start working on reduction campaigns, educating employees on how they can do things differently. And that's part of the value of increasing the quality of the data in the platform, is that if you use that general air travel emission factor and you start adjusting your travel patterns, you might not be able to see that impact based on the cost, even though the emissions will actually be going down.
Now, I've talked with hundreds of companies about how hard it is to just measure their scope 1 and 2 emissions. And this is a convenient way to do that. But scope 3 emissions, which can account for like 95% of many companies' impact, are really hard to crack. So what do you recommend we think about doing? Should every company be publishing its scope 1 and 2 emissions in order for everybody up and downstream to integrate their data into their calculations?
That would be fantastic. And I think there is definitely movement in that direction. You look at the CDP supply chain engagement, EcoVadis, these platforms that collect supply chain data from their suppliers. One of the primary purposes of this is collecting scope 1, 2, so that it can be used in the scope 3 inventory of a company. Another example is if you're an investor, the largest chunk of your scope 3 emissions is the emissions from your portfolio. And so having that direct access to that data is one of the primary drivers of companies even investing in carbon accounting. The other side is, like you're saying, every company is starting to publish this information publicly. And that's ultimately what we need. And I think what we're driving towards, and one of the things that's in development at Breeze, is the ability to publish your organization or your product's emission factor into a shared library. And we've been working with partners to start exploring this option of how do you make yourself competitive if one of the decision factors is carbon emissions? Well, if your product's a bit more expensive, but it's more sustainable or has a lower emissions per unit, if that company is using the spend-based method, you might not have an advantage. But if you can position yourself with your data-backed emission factor, showing that you're less than whatever they're using to calculate their emissions now, the equation changes and you become a much more attractive option. And so that's, I think, where we see this going, where it's not just a matter of scope 1, 2, but how do you position that so that it meets the needs of the other side of the equation?
Confidentiality has been one of the challenges for this transition all along, because you just mentioned the word transparency. Do you think that companies are ready to be that open based on your interaction with them?
Some, some are, some aren't. I think if you look at one of the values of movements like B Corp and this kind of transition towards sustainable business is that transparency needs to be there. But I think there are also ways for companies who are sensitive to this information, sensitive to releasing any information like this, to start kind of ease themselves into it or retain some degree of privacy. And so this is where giving a supplier access portal, for example, so that only your suppliers can have access to your emissions data for the products that they purchase. That's one way that you might be able to advance that. But ultimately, I think we'll end up with a level of transparency where the companies who see sustainability as an advantage will publish this information. And it's quite possible that will be a very large portion of the economy, partly due to the growth of sustainable business and due to regulations, where in Europe, it's no longer optional over a certain size to publish your scope 1, 2, and 3 emissions. This is likely coming in the United States. It's likely coming in Canada. It's already there in New Zealand, et cetera. So I think we'll see that mandatory reporting the same way we do with financial information for larger organizations. And that just leads to kind of more public availability of information, which kind of drives that forward.
Well, and of course, California is going to require this, although they were a little muddy about us actually when the bill was signed. Lucas, this is a great conversation. I want to take a quick commercial break. We're going to be right back. And we're back to talk more with Lucas Fraser. He is founder of Breeze, which is a carbon tracking platform for small and medium-sized business. Lucas, there are a lot of emerging standards. The International Sustainability Standards Board guidelines for reporting the financial impact of a company's ESG decisions is one. You mentioned CDP. There's the European system. Do you see where we're going with ESG reporting getting clear and really, truly comprehensive in terms of providing the information that we need as a society?
This is a really thorny question, one that is often one of the biggest barriers to people entering this field or trying to understand just what to spend their time focusing on. From where we see it, the single shining light for ESG, but specifically climate disclosures, is ISSB. And that's the IASB, the International Accounting Standards Board's Sustainability Working Group, who has now published standards for general sustainability reporting, so just the assessment and management of sustainability-related risks and opportunities, as well as the ISSB S2, which is focused on climate-related disclosures. This is essentially the gold standard for sustainability-related reporting, and they are going to be adding modules for other key environmental and social modules. But even if you look at the requirements, Europe, for example, is further ahead than the rest of the world in terms of mandatory ESG disclosures, and their standards are quite closely aligned with the ISSB. But if you look at anything outside of the European regulatory standard, everybody is saying, here's how we align with ISSB, here's how, if you're already reporting with us, it will fit well into ISSB, and there's a massive consolidation happening. You look at the consolidation that's already happened between the SASB, the value-based reporting, as well as a number of others have been, and the TCFD, my apologies, have already aligned to create the ISSB standard, and there's going to be further consolidation from there. And any additional standards that might come out will point towards their compatibility with ISSB. So if you want to really dive into your biodiversity reporting, there will be standards that you can complement your ISSB reporting with. So if you're looking for one to look for, it's ISSB.
So, and you mentioned the fact that there'll be new modules to report. At this point, do you feel like we're over-indexing on carbon and need to include biodiversity, water impacts, and other things like that?
I think so. I think with time that will come. I think there's always the concern that with additional complexity come additional barriers to entry. And that's what we're likely seeing. If the cost of reporting is $200,000 because you need 2 full-time employees in a system and you need to engage the rest of your company, it's not going to be that effective for smaller organizations. So you have to make that split. For SMEs, I would even say, as you're getting started, don't get so concerned about the reporting framework. If you need to do public standard aligned reporting, go with ISSB, but focus on making a program and getting data to back up that program first, and then have reporting be a secondary consideration. Because the content of that report will, it's all based on the actual quality of the programs that you have. For larger enterprise, absolutely, we need more reporting. We need more disclosure, quantification, measurement, and reduction of impacts across biodiversity, water, and all these other areas of consideration. And those are coming through regulation and through additional standards.
So how is Breeze thinking about building water waste and other business impacts into the reporting interface so that it becomes easy?
This is a great question. Our focus has really been on climate based on the need for the climate data, the complexity of calculating it. If you're measuring your water consumption, the amount of data points and external resources like emission factors you need is much smaller. And so the ability to measure that is easier to do in Excel or kind of as an add-on with other platforms. It's not a priority, at least for the next year, for us to build this into the platform. Going forward, I think we'll likely investigate a wider kind of platform approach to building in climate, other ESG metrics, potentially reporting, and especially reduction of impact. But for now, we're really just laser focused on climate.
Do you imagine, though, that in the not too distant future, consumer demand for more information, and particularly easily understood information that's derived from this very complex information, will drive the availability of product level information so that I could say, if I buy this product versus that product, I'm going to have a different impact?
I think so. And I think that will be something that, in the short term, I don't anticipate too much regulation or too much differentiation, but it's certainly coming. You look at best performers on sustainability in the consumer product category, there's much more on water, there's much more on waste because those are big issues. But as the world develops, climate's going to continue to be at the forefront of that.
Well, a little like QuickBooks, which you mentioned earlier and compared Breeze to, and which is now a comprehensive and often very confusing platform. How do you imagine Breeze's role in the industry changing? QuickBooks now is also a transaction processing platform and an email platform for marketing. Do you imagine Breeze being the exchange point for emissions data and other information between participants in the supply chain? You talked about some potential partnerships.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think there's two sides to that. And all of these, we're still focusing on how we can best build these out to be simple, like you said, because we don't want an overly complex platform. That's the opposite of what we're trying to do. But there's really two sides. And one is when you have direct need for information passed between entities. You look at an investor, like a venture capital or private equity firm, and their portfolio. That's often a very direct connection where, as an investor, we need access to your scope 1, 2, 3 in detail for our reporting and for our risk assessment. That's one angle that's going to be very important. And the other side of that relationship, those direct relationships, is supply chain, like I mentioned, where you're saying we assess the emissions of all of our suppliers for use in our inventory and for assessment of whether we want to continue working with these businesses. That side is definitely coming, and there will be a direct data exchange platform like we're starting to see across the industry. I imagine we'll start to see communication protocols between platforms as well. So even if you're not using Breeze, you'd be able to exchange and receive data from Breeze to other platforms on carbon and on these other metrics. The other side is, like I was saying before, the emission factors for businesses. And so not necessarily passing total emissions, but saying, for our product, here's our impact. You can see that transparently. It becomes comparable with other businesses because it's per unit or per dollar or whatever metric is most relevant.
How do you suggest a company think about beginning to present its impact data to consumers? And I'll give you an example. I was talking with a chef the other day who said that they wanted to better characterize not just the carbon emissions, but the provenance, the water use, the other impacts of the ingredients that they buy for the meals that they serve, because they want to tell a story about the meal.
I think that's, you nailed it right there. That's often so much about storytelling, because there's only so much that you can prove with an individual data point about the emissions per unit.
Right.
And
well, what do you do with
data
to make it that part of a story? How would you, thinking about what you know about small, medium-sized enterprise today, advise them to use the data in storytelling?
I think what's interesting is that once you have an assessment, once you have data, you can compare over time and across units. So you can say, here's what we used to do. Last year, our emissions were X from this product category, and now they're significantly lower based on the decisions that we made. That's a point that comes really easily into the story. The alternative to say, across these two ingredients, if we source our chicken from the local farm versus from a factory farm, here's the scale of impact that changes and how we can show that with data. I think that's a really interesting way to integrate that into your storytelling, because then it adds whole new life to the story as well.
Right, and the chef is a good example because it's so quick, dynamic. Their menu changes on a weekly basis, if not daily. But
Hmm.
for a business, a small business in particular, um, it's a little different and a less challenging issue. But
Hmm.
what would you tell a small business to begin to communicate about their impact? I mean, in the opening, I was talking about how much CO2 I estimate Earth911 produces. Is that something you think people are going to engage with?
I think that the challenge with carbon data is that, we like to say, you can say our emissions are 100 tons, but nobody necessarily knows what that means. And so I
Yeah.
think it's about relative comparison. So if you have any sort of comparison, the best one is to yourself. So you can say last year our emissions were this. Now, since we've increased our focus on climate and on its sustainability, our emissions have gone down based on these decisions that we made. That's the best case scenario. And so we don't generally recommend that you start communicating your emissions until you've got 2 years of data or some sort of time series, because then you can show progress, you can show changes, you can show integration, whereas a single number might not be so meaningful unless you're using it to say, we've begun our baseline and this is a priority for us. So look out for our next update in the future.
It's interesting as I read a lot of sustainability reports, and longitudinal views is something that many of them avoid. And I think that's because they are not comfortable with the data that they're collecting. If you're thinking about your business's impact, is carbon intensity the thing that you might want to best,
Yeah.
is the best thing to focus on?
Carbon intensity, which would be your total emissions divided by your floor area of a facility or by revenue, can be a really good one. We like to flip that on its head and use the metric carbon productivity, which I think we first discovered in the Corporate Knights top 100 companies. And it's essentially saying how much revenue do we generate per ton emitted, as opposed to how many tons per dollar. So you say, if we use ton as basically an investment metric, we're using energy, we're using emissions to build our business. How much are we getting from each ton? And how can we increase the amount of money we make while reducing the emissions? That would increase our productivity. So we like to use that metric. So tons, dollars per ton, for example.
So there's a lot of conversation about degrowth, but what we're really talking about is a transition from more carbon intensive or less carbon productive business to less so or more so. And that's a story that we need to get everybody thinking about. Is you're looking for the low carbon businesses to work with.
Mm-hmm.
And again, this has to do with communication. Do we need badging? Do we need something that says this is a good company to do business with for the planet? And is that oversimplifying and greenwashing?
Yeah, I mean, they're tough questions, and the best path I tend to recommend is say, look for the companies that disclose the most, that have the most transparency, because they're doing the most to make sure that what they're able to communicate is legitimate and is backed up. That's
More than the
often
badge.
very much the case. More than a badge, because the badge has become, I don't know if you've seen Seaspiracy, for example, but a badge even with the best intentions can lose its meaning when applied across a wider scope. And so while a badge can be helpful and some of them are still useful, looking at B Corp can still be quite relevant. It's hard to say yes or no whether a badge will actually mean sustainability. And most likely, especially if it's covering more than one angle, like if it's beyond climate, it's oversimplifying things and it might be difficult to trust.
So how much does Breeze cost? How much does it is involved in getting started and beginning to be able to present that information?
Yeah. So we try to be quite competitive with pricing. I think this has traditionally been quite a complex field. Like I said before, most of the platforms have been focused on larger organizations or even working with a consultant for this work, which can be quite expensive. We have a free version of our platform, which is available to anybody for an unlimited amount of time without limits to the number of sources that you might want to track, the number of facilities, the number of users. The only limit is the amount of data points. And so you can calculate your emissions as long as you have under 20 unique data points. And that's available for free at mybreeze.io. Our pricing is focused for businesses who are using this information for decision-making or reporting. That's where we tend to add additional features and increase that cap on data points. So if you're a larger organization that wants more granular data, let's say monthly data for your electricity, so you can analyze trends, or more individual spend categories, or just more complexity in your scope 3, that's where you might need more data points. You also get live support with some of these plans. And so we have a pro plan, which starts at $99 US a month. and a business plan which starts at $249 a month. For larger organizations, because while we're focused generally on SMEs, we do work with much larger organizations in the order of $1 billion plus revenue, thousands of employees, and they generally have custom pricing. But at $99 a month or $1,000 a year, you save 2 months. It's a relatively low cost for having really high quality emissions data that you can share with customers, with investors, with whomever.
Do you find that most companies start with the free plan and then step up? Did they put a toe in the water?
Absolutely. That's our whole model, is to say, try it. Try before you buy. Log into the platform, understand whether it meets your needs, whether it fits best for you, and then upgrade when you find that there's value for you. That's the way we like to operate. That's why we don't push anybody with a 30-day free trial or forcing them to talk to us before a demo. You can just log in, sign up, and try it out. We do have some companies who might come through consulting partners or others who jump straight into the paid plan when they know their needs exceed the free plan, because sometimes it's easier to get started with the paid features like live support and that kind of thing. But generally companies they'll have, similar to how you might see Slack starting in a company. Slack is another example of applying the same model of product-led growth, where a single person signs up for Slack, sends a message to their coworker, a team starts using it, and then the company buys the tool because they need the more advanced enterprise features. It's very similar to how Breeze works.
So you've looked at a lot of this data. What are the 3 or 5 most effective changes a business can make to reduce their environmental impact based on what you know?
Fly less.
Okay.
Work with suppliers who disclose their emissions as well, because if you've measured your emissions, you're generally using the industry average factor, which includes some pretty high emitting organizations. So if you can get industry specific or supplier specific data for products you're buying, that will actually generally decrease your emissions significantly. And yeah, basically be more conscious about the products and services that you buy. We do have a whole kind of roadmap. It depends on type of organization. If you're a really energy intensive organization, like we work with logistics, production, manufacturing companies who use a lot of energy, a lot of fuel, a lot of products like that in their facilities, there's a whole different roadmap for electrification, using alternative fuels, looking for efficiency. Efficiency, one of the biggest underrated projects or focuses for sustainability projects. If you increase the efficiency, so that reduce the amount of energy used to accomplish the same task, that will reduce your emissions proportionately. It shouldn't be undervalued. It's often a really impactful one. So it depends on the organization. If you're a smaller one who most of your emissions are scope 3, flying less, being more conscious about the products and services and organizations that you purchase and work with. If you're a larger organization or more energy intensive, efficiency is a huge way to go. And after that, electrification.
There's a big back to the office movement after the pandemic going on. Do you have a sense of whether or not remote workers or remote organizations are more or less efficient in the long run?
I would say going back to the office increases emissions in general, because we do measure emissions from work from home as well. You might count the electricity, gas, refrigeration, AC for home offices, but you no longer have a commute factor. When you have employees driving in, flying in, taking the bus, all these have emissions, and those aren't generally counted as an organization's emissions when you work from home. So that's the biggest jump when everybody comes back to the office, is the commute. And these days, people generally have a home office and an office, a shared office. So you might have to start measuring the emissions from both. Right. So you're basically just adding on these whole new categories. So decentralized can be pretty efficient emissions-wise, unless you're one of those organizations that has 3 or 4 corporate retreats a year that you fly to Mexico or fly to the mountains.
Flying again. All right. So that flying is really
flying is tough, and so it's worth looking into that.
How can our listeners keep up on what's going on at Breeze?
The best way is sign up for Breeze and try it out. I mean, what we want to do is get more people using the platform, experimenting with it, and getting that initial sense of their emissions. And if you sign up, you're enrolled in the mailing lists. You can keep up with our updates as well. We're also quite active on LinkedIn if you search for Breeze GHG Accounting.
Hey, Lucas, thanks for spending time with the Earth911 community today. We really appreciate it.
My pleasure, Mitch. Thanks for having me.
That was my conversation with Breeze founder Lucas Fraser. The Breeze carbon accounting tool is available with a free limited service and Subscription costs range from $99 to $249 based on levels of support and functionality. If you're a small business owner, I encourage you to use the free version to get a sense of your carbon emissions. It will get you thinking. Visit mybreeze.io. MyBreeze, all one word, no space, no dash. mybreeze.io to learn more. Sustainability teams in large organizations are often very budget constrained, and it's difficult to get support for communicating the environmental impacts to customers and the market without making a strong case to the marketing team to get the budget necessary to tell the story. As sustainability programs start to improve the bottom line by, for instance, creating savings through reduced waste internally, I found that marketing teams then become willing to provide a budget. The challenge, though, for small businesses and entrepreneurial founders is not much different. They have to balance their available time for tracking carbon and other environmental impacts with everything else and make it fit into the budget. In short, the small business has every challenge the large one does, but with fewer resources. Tools like Breeze can raise the small business game, making it easier to track and account for their emissions, as 30 years ago QuickBooks did for accounting problems. The evolution of standards for exchanging environmental data among small, medium, and large businesses is the next frontier. When an infrastructure and standard format for exchanging environmental data is available, the Scope 3 problem will be solvable, not necessarily solved, but solvable, and a comprehensive view of the economy's environmental impact could finally come into focus. But government must keep the pressure on business to drive that evolution. The EU, unfortunately, recently delayed its required carbon accounting rules by 2 years, and California's SB 253, which was signed recently by Governor Gavin Newsom, requires disclosure of carbon emissions by companies in the state, but it won't go into effect until 2026 and may slip further. Despite that slow progress, it's critical that society reduce emissions, and every effort a business makes can contribute to potentially achieving the 50% reductions necessary by 2030. We're not on track to do it, but we might get there if we all start to pull together. Don't be a climate inactivist. Get started measuring your company's impact regardless of its size. It can make a difference. And we'll continue to talk about this on the show, so stay tuned. I hope you'll take a moment to share this podcast or any of the more than 430 interviews that we've produced on sustainability in your ear. You know, writing a review on your favorite podcast platform can help your neighbors find us, so please take a moment to do so. You folks are the amplifiers that spread more ideas so we create less waste. Please tell your friends, family, coworkers, the people you meet on the street that they can find us on Apple Podcasts, Spotify, iHeartRadio, Audible, or any of the fine purveyors of podcast goodness they prefer. Thank you for your support. I'm Mitch Ratcliffe. This is Earth911, and we will be back with another innovator interview soon. In the meantime, folks, take care of yourself, take care of one another, and let's all take care of this beautiful planet of ours. Have a green day.